You make the world feel wide again.
And you make it feel safe.
Out on the wide plains of the 1800s, people whispered of a girl who grew too tall, too strong, too different. They called her cursed. Her own blood turned against her and sold her like cattle. She was dragged across towns, shown off like a beast, marked not for life, but for slaughter. Crowds laughed. Men wagered. A butcher sharpened his knives. But then a cowboy appeared, a man broken in his own ways, yet unwilling to watch her die. He laid down silver and claimed her, not as property, not as meat, but as something no one else had dared to see human. This is the story of Tula, the Apache Giantess, and the cowboy who chose to stand against the world for her. Like this story so far? If it's pulling at something in your chest, or if you just love a good Wild West mystery, go ahead and like this video, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss the next chapter. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We love seeing how far these stories ride. Now back to the tale. 1846, Apache Territory, Arizona. The night Tula was born, the desert winds wailed so fierce they rattled the brush huts of the Mescalero people. Elders whispered it was a bad omen. Her mother, Suna, cradled the newborn girl to her breast, sweat still beading on her brow, and felt the baby's strange weight. Long limbs, broad shoulders, hands too big for a child. The old women muttered among themselves. One spat tobacco in the dirt. Another crossed her arms and turned away. From the very first breath, Tula was marked. By the time she could walk, she towered over other children. When they ran laughing across the dust, she lumbered behind, her shadow twice their size. Boys tested her strength by shoving, and when she pushed back, they flew hard into the dirt. No one praised her for it. No one called her gifted. Instead, the whispers grew louder. Cursed, unnatural, wrong. Her mother alone shielded her. Suna smoothed Tula's long black hair at night and pressed soft words against her ear. You are not a beast. You are my daughter. But her father, Cheno, could not hide his shame. A hunter, proud of his bow and his horses, he scowled at her bulk. By the time she was 10, Tula's head rose above his. He could not look at her without his jaw tightening. When visitors came to their camp, he kept her inside, as if ashamed to let the world see what kind of child had come from his blood. Seasons changed, and Tula grew past what anyone thought a woman could be. At 13, her shoulders were as broad as any warrior's, her hands large enough to crush clay pots in her grip. When she walked through the camp, children pointed and laughed. Women averted their eyes. Men shook their heads. At night, she lay awake listening to coyotes howl, wondering why the Great Spirit had carved her from stone instead of flesh. Then the drought came. The rivers thinned to mud. Corn stalks withered. Hunters returned with empty hands. Bellies shrank, ribs showed. The people grew restless, angry, desperate. One night, the firelight danced against Cheno's hard face. Suna clutched Tula's wrist, sensing what was coming, but she had no power to stop it. Her father spoke with 2 white traders who had ridden into camp, their saddlebags heavy with dried beans and salt pork. The men's eyes lingered on Tula as if she were some strange animal they'd never seen before. They laughed, slapped their knees, and offered silver. Cheno's jaw worked like a blade. He would not look at his daughter. Suna cried out, but the trade was done. At dawn, Tula was bound at the wrists with rawhide and shoved toward the traders' horses. Her mother wept into her hands. Cheno turned his back. Tula, taller than both white men combined, could have torn free. She could have run, but something inside her was already broken, crushed by years of ridicule. She lowered her head and let herself be led away. The road east was cruel. Dust stung her eyes, ropes burned her wrists. In small towns, people crowded to gawk. She was shoved onto wagons, paraded through muddy streets like a carnival creature. The Apache Giantess, a trader barked in Kansas City, banging a drum. Too big to breed, too wild to tame. Children squealed. Men guffawed. Women clutched their shawls and muttered prayers. Some tossed stones. Others poked her with sticks as if to see if she was real. She learned to keep her face blank, her gaze low. Inside, shame hollowed her out. But the traitors had no intention of keeping her alive for long. To them, she was worth more dead than breathing. In saloons and stockyards, whispers spread. A butcher from Kansas had set aside money for her carcass. They said her flesh would sell pound for pound, like cattle. She heard these words in broken English, pieced together through the haze of fear. And for the first time, she prayed for death. One gray morning, they pushed her into an auction pen in Abilene. Mud clung to her ankles, chains rattled at her wrists. Around her, men drank whiskey and laughed, betting on how soon the butcher's blade would fall. And that's when she saw him, a cowboy, lean but weathered, his hat pulled low, a limp in his left leg. He stood apart from the crowd, arms crossed, watching. His name was Ezekiel Boone. His face was sun-carved, his eyes tired, yet when they settled on her, she felt no mockery, no hunger, just a strange stillness. The auctioneer hollered. The butcher shouted his price. Silver coins clattered into a wooden box. Laughter roared through the pen. But Ezekiel didn't laugh. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the mud, and laid down more silver than the butcher. The crowd fell quiet. "You're out of your mind, Boone," someone yelled. "She ain't no woman. She's a mule. Won't last a week." Another spat. Ezekiel said nothing. He just looked at Tula, and in that silence, something inside her stirred. A flicker, faint as the first light before dawn. The traders grumbled but took the money. The butcher cursed, and with a flick of his knife, Ezekiel cut her bonds. Tula staggered, blood rushing to her freed wrists. She expected him to shove her, to bark orders, to claim her as property. But he only stepped back, tipping his hat. "Walk free if you've a mind to," he said. The crowd laughed harder than ever, certain she would crush him, certain she would bolt. But Tula didn't move. She stood in the mud, staring at this cowboy who looked at her like no one else ever had. For once, she wasn't a curse. She wasn't a freak. She was something worth choosing. And for the first time in her life, she wondered if fate had not already decided her end. The chains fell to the mud, and Tula's wrists burned raw where the leather had dug into her flesh. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. She stood towering above the jeering crowd, shoulders slumped, eyes half dead, waiting for the next command, the next shove. That had always been her life: obey, endure, survive. But this cowboy, this stranger, had cut her bonds and stepped back as if daring her to walk away. She didn't believe it. Freedom was a word she'd never been allowed. If she ran, men would chase her down. If she stayed, the butcher would return with sharper knives. She glanced at Ezekiel Boone. He stood calm, his limp setting him a little off balance, his hat brim shadowing his eyes. Something about him was different from the rest. Too still, too quiet. The butcher bellowed from the pen, face red as boiled meat. "She ain't no woman, Boone. She's mine by right." The auctioneer tried to calm him, pointing at the box heavy with Ezekiel's silver. The butcher lunged for Tula's arm, thick fingers reaching like hooks. Reflex flared through her, and for once she didn't shrink back. She shoved him. The man flew across the mud like a rag doll, crashing into the fence. The crowd roared with drunken laughter. "Ha! She'll kill you in your sleep, Boone!" someone shouted. Tula's chest heaved. The butcher groaned, sprawled in the dirt, rage twisting his mouth. Ezekiel didn't flinch. He simply shifted his weight to his good leg and motioned toward the open gate. "Come on." Tula narrowed her eyes. She expected a trick. But his hand didn't reach for a rope, and he didn't bark orders. He turned his back on her and started walking. The crowd gasped. Nobody in their right mind turned their back on the so-called Apache Giantess. And still he walked. Something inside her cracked. She followed, not because she trusted him, not because she believed in kindness, but because, for once, there was a road open, and no one had shoved her down it. The jeers trailed behind them as they left the auction yard. Mud clung to her ankles, her shoulders ached from years of carrying shame. But with every step she took after Ezekiel Boone, the noise of the crowd faded until it was nothing but wind. They reached the edge of town where his horse, a scarred bay gelding, was tied to a post. Ezekiel untied the reins and stroked the horse's muzzle before glancing up at her. "You ride." Tula's lips parted. It had been years since she'd spoken more than a handful of broken English words, but she knew enough to answer. "No." He nodded once, as if that was all he needed. He adjusted the saddle and held out the reins. "You'll learn." She stared at him, bewildered. No man had ever spoken to her without mockery or disgust. She waited for the insult, for the smirk. It didn't come. Only that quiet, steady tone. When she didn't move, he swung himself into the saddle with a grunt, wincing at the strain on his leg. Then he held out a hand. Up. For a moment, she hesitated. Touching another man's hand had always meant pain, humiliation, or chains. But Ezekiel's hand was just there, firm, steady, waiting. Slowly, she took it. Her palm engulfed his, and with surprising strength, he hauled her up behind him. They rode out of Abilene. The prairie stretched endless, golden grass bending in the evening wind. The horizon burned with sunset, streaked with crimson and violet. For the first time in her life, Tula breathed without chains cutting her skin. She clung to the saddle, feeling the steady sway of the horse beneath them, and dared to wonder if this wasn't a dream. Behind them, she knew the butcher's fury hadn't ended. Men like that didn't forgive. He would come for her, for Ezekiel, for vengeance. But as the town shrank into nothing but dust on the horizon, Tula let her head tilt back and drank in the open sky. Night fell. They stopped by a creek, the horse snorting as it lowered its head to drink. Ezekiel slid stiffly from the saddle and gathered wood for a fire. Tula stood watching, unsure if she was meant to help. Finally, she bent and stacked branches twice as large as his, laying them beside the fire pit. He gave her a single nod of approval and struck flint. Sparks flared. Flame caught. Shadows leapt around them. She sat cross-legged across from him, knees pulled tight against her chest. Her stomach growled. Ezekiel unwrapped a bundle from his saddlebag and tossed her a strip of jerky. She sniffed it cautiously, then tore into it with her teeth. Salt stung her tongue. For once, food wasn't thrown at her like scraps to a dog. It was given. They ate in silence, the fire popping between them. Ezekiel chewed slow, eyes fixed on the flames. At last, he spoke. "You've a name." She swallowed hard, throat dry. Her voice came rough, low. "Tula." He repeated it softly, testing the shape of it. "Tula." He nodded, as if the name itself mattered. "I'm Ezekiel Boone." She tilted her head, studying him. He wasn't young. His beard was streaked with gray, his eyes rimmed with the weight of years. His limp marked him as broken, yet he carried himself with the steadiness of a man who had walked through hell and found the other side. He caught her stare and smirked faintly. "You've questions. Ask." Her tongue faltered. Questions boiled in her chest, but she didn't know which to trust. Finally, one slipped free. "Why?" His brow furrowed. "Why what? Why buy?" Her voice cracked. "Why not kill? Same, like others." The firelight flickered across his face, carving the lines deeper. He tossed a twig into the flames and leaned back. "I've seen enough killing. I was in the war, watched men torn apart, watched boys younger than you strung up like hogs. I've no stomach left for slaughter." His gaze sharpened. "And I saw your eyes. You're not a beast. You're just someone the world decided to trample." Tula blinked. No one had ever said such words to her. Not even her mother, who had loved her fiercely, had spoken with such plain certainty. Her chest ached. For a long moment, she could not breathe. They sat there in silence until the stars blinked awake across the sky. The fire hissed low. Coyotes cried in the distance. For the first time in years, Tula closed her eyes without chains cutting her wrists. Sleep crept over her like a fragile blessing. But freedom was not without its price. At dawn, Ezekiel saddled the horse again. Tula rubbed her wrists, the welts still raw. As she helped him pack the fire, a noise carried across the wind. Hoofbeats, more than one. Ezekiel stiffened. His hand went to the rifle strapped to the saddle. Tula turned toward the sound. Dust rose on the horizon, riders, fast and many. Her stomach clenched. The butcher had wasted no time. "Mount up," Ezekiel ordered. She obeyed, swinging into the saddle with surprising ease. The horse whinnied, feeling her weight, but Ezekiel steadied it with a pat. They rode hard, grass whipping against their legs as the sun rose bloody red. Tula looked back once. The riders were closer, guns glinting. Fury surged in her chest, hot and wild. For the first time, fear was not the only thing she felt. She felt anger. At her father, at the traitors, at every hand that had shoved her down. She would not go back. She would not be meat. The chase had begun. The prairie stretched endless and merciless, tall grass hissing like snakes in the morning wind. The sun was barely above the horizon, but already the air shimmered with heat. Ezekiel leaned low over the horse's neck, jaw tight, eyes flicking back at the riders who thundered in pursuit. The butcher had sent 6 men, all mounted, all armed, and all hungry for blood. Tula clung to the saddle behind him, her massive frame rocking with each stride. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She had known fear before, but not like this. Not the kind that roared up behind her with pistols raised and faces twisted in greed. Ezekiel snapped the reins, urging the gelding faster. "Hold on, girl." Tula's arms wrapped around his torso, steady as iron bands. She felt his ribs shift with each breath, the muscles in his back taut with strain. His limp kept him from balancing smooth in the saddle, and she knew he couldn't ride like this forever. The riders closed the distance. Gunfire cracked, sharp and ugly in the open air. A bullet hissed past Tula's ear, slicing the wind. Another tore up dirt at the horse's hooves. The gelding screamed and lunged forward. "Down!" Ezekiel barked, shoving her head low against his shoulder. He swung his rifle back one-handed and fired. A rider jerked sideways, his horse veering off as the man toppled into the grass. 5 left. Tula's pulse hammered. She had never held a gun, never fired a shot, but something inside her stirred. The same force that had sent the butcher sprawling in the auction yard. Strength. Rage. She would not be taken again. "Give me!" she shouted, reaching for the rifle. Ezekiel spared her a glance, surprised, but didn't argue. He shoved the weapon into her hands. The weight of it startled her, heavy, solid, alive with purpose. She gripped it clumsily, fingers too large for the trigger guard, but her eyes narrowed on the riders. She waited, heart slamming in her throat. The closest man whooped, raising his revolver. She pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but the bullet struck true. The man's hat flew, blood spraying as he toppled. His horse screamed, bolting wild. For left, the others cursed, rage twisting their faces. Bullets rained around them. Tula fired again, wild but near enough to make one man duck low. She felt power flood her veins, a savage kind of freedom. For years she had been paraded, mocked, shoved. Now she was fighting back, and it tasted like fire. But their horse was tiring. Foam streaked its neck, hooves faltering in the soft earth. Ezekiel cursed under his breath. Can't outrun him. His eyes scanned the horizon, calculating. We'll make a stand. Tula's chest heaved. A stand meant death or worse, but she saw in his eyes that he meant it. He would not hand her over. He would die first. They veered toward a dry creek bed, its banks cut sharp and low. Ezekiel hauled the reins, sending the gelding skidding down the slope. Tula clutched the rifle close as the horse stumbled to a halt. Off! Ezekiel barked. They slid from the saddle. Ezekiel crouched low, checking his revolver. 2 bullets left. He handed Tula the rifle again. Keep steady. Don't waste shots. Tula swallowed hard, sweat stinging her eyes. She dropped to one knee beside him, her massive frame shielding half his body. The riders approached fast, hooves rattling the dry earth, dust clouds rising like smoke. The first man charged down the bank. Ezekiel fired, hitting him square in the chest. He toppled backward, tumbling limp into the creek bed. 3 left. Tula aimed at the next rider, her breath ragged, finger tight on the trigger. The shot cracked. Miss. The man howled and fired back, dirt kicking up at her feet. She gritted her teeth, chambered another round, and fired again. This time the bullet caught his arm. He screamed, reeling sideways, pistol flying from his grip. His horse bolted, leaving him clutching the wound. 2 left. The last pair slowed, circling warily. One pulled a lariat from his saddle horn, spinning it overhead. The other grinned, eyes locked on Tula like a butcher sighting fresh meat. The rope whistled. It snapped around Tula's wrist, biting deep. The rider yanked hard, dragging her forward. She roared, fury ripping from her chest. Instead of falling, she planted her feet in the dirt and heaved. The horse stumbled, nearly yanking the rider from the saddle. He cursed, fighting for control, but Tula's strength was monstrous. With one savage pull, she dragged him clean from the saddle. He hit the ground with a bone-cracking thud, rope still wrapped around her wrist. She stomped down on him, her shadow swallowing his body, and with a twist of her arms, snapped the rope free. The last rider froze, staring at her wide-eyed. Tula's chest heaved, her eyes blazing. She raised the rifle and fired. The shot struck the ground at his horse's hooves, and the animal reared, screaming. The man lost his grip, tumbling backward into the dust. The prairie fell silent. Only the whimper of wounded men and the frantic snorts of panicked horses remained. Tula stood tall in the creek bed, chest heaving, sweat gleaming on her brow. Ezekiel rose beside her, holstering his revolver with a grunt. He looked at the fallen riders, then at her. His lips curved into the faintest smile. "Hell of a shot," he said. Tula's hands trembled. The rifle slipped, clattering to the dirt. She dropped to her knees, breath shuddering. She had never taken a life before. The first man, the one she had shot clean through, lay somewhere in the grass, his blood soaking the earth. She hadn't meant to, or maybe she had. Her stomach twisted. Tears burned hot in her eyes. Ezekiel crouched in front of her, gripping her chin gently. His touch was rough, calloused, but not cruel. He lifted her gaze to his. "Don't let it break you. You did what you had to do. They'd have carved you up like cattle." Her lips trembled. "I kill. You lived." His voice was firm, steady. "There's a difference." For a long moment, the world narrowed to his weathered face and the certainty in his eyes. Slowly, her breathing calmed. The tears didn't fall. She swallowed them, just as she had swallowed every insult, every jeer. But this time it wasn't shame. It was survival. They mounted again, leaving the wounded riders groaning in the dust. The prairie opened before them, endless and golden, but darker now, shadowed by what she had done. Tula clutched the saddle horn, her hands raw and shaking. Ezekiel rode steady, though his limp made him stiff in the saddle. At last he spoke. "You're strong, girl, stronger than any man I've seen. But strength alone won't keep you alive. You've got to learn when to use it and when to hold back." She frowned, her broken English struggling. "You teach." His eyes softened, just for a heartbeat. "If you'll let me." The horse's hooves drummed steady against the earth, carrying them farther from the butcher's men, farther from chains. Tula stared at the horizon, her chest heavy with fear, guilt, and something else she had never known before. Hope. The prairie rolled on for days, and each mile carried Tula farther from the chains of her past, yet closer to the weight of her choices. Every night, when they stopped to rest, she felt the faces of the men she'd brought down staring at her from the darkness. Their screams followed her into sleep. Her hands, the same ones that had been mocked as monstrous, now trembled with the memory of pulling a trigger. Ezekiel never asked if she was haunted. He knew. She could see it in the way he stared into the fire, jaw clenched, eyes distant. His limp grew worse in the evenings, and once, when he thought she wasn't watching, she saw him peel back his trouser leg to reveal scar tissue twisted and ugly from an old wound. He had lived with pain longer than she had. By the fourth night, they had crossed into a valley where cottonwoods rose along a lazy creek. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, and crickets sang in the grass. Ezekiel tethered the horse and sat against a tree with his revolver across his knees. Tula gathered firewood, her movements awkward but determined. She had learned fast how to choose dry branches, how to strike flint. Small things, but each one hers. The fire licked high, throwing gold across her face. She sat across from him, knees drawn up, eyes fixed on the flames. Silence pressed heavy until Ezekiel finally spoke. "You carry it heavy." Tula glanced up. His eyes were on her, steady, unblinking. She hesitated, English still broken on her tongue. "I kill." He shook his head slowly. "You lived." Her brow furrowed. She wanted to believe him, but the blood on her hands felt too thick. "Spirit? No, forgive." Ezekiel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His voice dropped low, gravel against the night. "I've done worse than you, girl. I've seen war. I've cut men down up close. Some deserved it, some didn't. You think my spirit's clean?" He jabbed a finger at his chest. "It ain't, never will be, but I keep living. That's all a man or woman can do." Tula's eyes glistened. She pressed a fist to her chest as if holding her heart together. "Always alone, always curse." Something softened in his face. He stared at her, not with pity, but with the quiet recognition of a soul beaten the same way. "Not anymore." The words struck her harder than any blow. She lowered her gaze, fighting the burn in her throat. For the first time, the thought crept in that perhaps she wasn't cursed to walk alone. The fire snapped, sending sparks into the dark. Ezekiel leaned back against the tree, his hat pulled low. Tula sat awake long after, staring at him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. At dawn, they rode again. The sky was wide and cruel, painted in orange and red. They followed the creek east, grass brushing their boots. For hours, nothing but silence and hoofbeats. By midday, they came across a burned-out homestead. Smoke still curled faint from the ruins. The house had been torched, the barn collapsed. A chicken coop lay empty, doors flung open. Ezekiel pulled up the reins, scanning the scene. "Raiders," he muttered. Tula dismounted, her long legs carrying her into the blackened yard. She crouched beside a charred post, running her fingers over the ash. The air stank of death. Beneath a collapsed beam, she saw it, the small, still hand of a child. Her chest seized. "Tula!" Ezekiel called sharply, but she ignored him. She shoved the beam aside with her massive strength, exposing the body of a little girl, no more than 6, her dress singed, her face turned to the earth. Tula's throat closed. Memories of being a child mocked and shunned flooded her. That could have been her, snuffed out, nameless, forgotten. Ezekiel's boots crunched behind her. He laid a hand on her shoulder. "Nothing we can do here." She turned her head sharply, eyes wet and blazing. "Barry." He studied her a long moment, then nodded. Together, they dug with their hands, the earth dry and stubborn. Sweat streaked their faces, dirt caked their nails. By the time the sun tipped west, the girl lay covered in a shallow grave, marked by stones. Tula knelt beside it, whispering words in Apache. Ezekiel stood back, hat in hand, his face unreadable. When it was done, they mounted again, the weight of silence between them. But something had shifted. Tula felt the dead girl's spirit in her chest, mingling with her own pain, shaping her rage into something larger. She was no longer just running. She was surviving for more than herself. That night, they camped in a canyon where the rocks rose high and jagged. The moon cast silver over the walls, and owls called from the cliffs. Tula sat by the fire, staring into the flames. "Why you help?" she asked suddenly. Her voice cracked the silence like a whip. Ezekiel lifted his eyes. Because no one helped me when I needed it. She tilted her head. Your people leave you? He breathed out slowly, eyes shadowed by memory. I fought in Tennessee. Rifle fire, cannon smoke, men screaming. I got hit in the leg. My regiment left me to rot. Crawled 2 miles on my hands before a farmer's wife found me. His jaw clenched. Never trusted anyone much after that. Figured the world only takes. Until you. Tula's brow furrowed. Me? He nodded once. Saw you in that pen. Chains cutting your skin. Eyes dead but still burning inside. Couldn't let em kill you. Maybe saving you was saving what's left of me. The words sank into her bones. For so long, she had believed she was nothing more than a curse. A freak. But to him, she was something worth saving. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she sat in silence, her heart pounding against her ribs. The canyon echoed with the sound of night. But neither of them saw the shadowed figure watching from the cliffs above, rifle glinting in the moonlight. At dawn, gunfire shattered the silence. Bullets chipped stone inches from their heads. Ezekiel cursed, dragging Tula behind a boulder. The horse reared, screaming. It's the butcher's men, he shouted. Tula clutched the rifle, eyes wide. The canyon amplified every shot, the sound deafening. Dust stung her eyes, stone splinters cutting her cheek. Ezekiel returned fire, his limp slowing his movements. Tula saw it, the way he gritted his teeth with every crouch, every shift. He was strong, but not unbreakable. And if he fell, she would be alone again. Something inside her hardened. She hefted the rifle, sighted the shooter high on the cliff. Her hands shook, but she breathed deep, steadying. She squeezed the trigger. The man jerked back with a cry, his rifle tumbling from his hands. Another shot rang out, closer this time. A second rider had flanked them, hidden among the rocks. Tula swung around, but too slow. The man's revolver leveled on Ezekiel. No! The word tore from her chest. She surged forward, massive hand closing around the revolver barrel just as it fired. The shot scorched her palm, pain lancing up her arm. With a snarl, she ripped the weapon free and smashed the butt into his face. He crumpled, blood spraying, breath ragged. She tossed the gun aside and stumbled back. Her hand burned, skin blistering. Ezekiel caught her arm, pulling her behind cover. You saved my damn life, he muttered, eyes flashing. Tula winced at the pain but lifted her chin. For the first time, she realized she wasn't only following him. She was fighting beside him. When the canyon fell silent, 2 bodies lay sprawled on the rocks. Ezekiel exhaled slow, lowering his revolver. Tula leaned against the boulder, chest heaving. The smell of gunpowder clung to the air. Ezekiel wrapped a strip of cloth around her burned palm, his touch surprisingly gentle. You'll have a scar. She met his eyes. Many scars. He gave a rough chuckle. Fair enough. As the sun climbed over the canyon walls, Tula stared at the bodies cooling in the dust. She no longer felt just fear or guilt. She felt something sharper, clearer, resolve. The world had marked her for slaughter, but she would not go quietly. And standing beside Ezekiel Boone, she began to believe she never had to go alone again. The sun baked the plains that morning with a heat that felt like it was burning away the thin veil of peace left in Tula's world. She woke before the cowboy did, her body aching from the ground, her breath shallow from dreams that were no dream at all, only memories of chains, laughter, and the butcher's knives that had once been sharpened for her. The prairie stretched in silence, broken only by the faint cry of a hawk overhead, and she sat upright, her enormous hands pressed into the dirt. Will had slept with his hat tipped low, his rifle near, the fire long gone to ashes. She studied him for a moment, this stranger who had stepped into her misery, not with promises, not with honeyed words, but with a single bold act. He'd claimed her when no one else dared. Her heart didn't trust the quiet of it yet. She'd been owned before. She'd been handled, traded, and treated like an oddity since girlhood. What made this time different? Still, when his eyes opened and met hers, She felt something shift. Will gave a short nod, like men did when they respected someone, and rose to his feet. We've got to move. Townsfolk won't forget what happened yesterday. His voice was calm, but Tula heard the weight beneath it. He wasn't just thinking of angry whispers. He was thinking of men with rifles and lawmen with bribes in their pockets. Tula stood, towering above him, the morning light painting her figure in gold. "They'll come," she said quietly, her voice carrying the gravel of a soul hardened by years of ridicule. "They always do." Will tied down his gear, then looked at her as if he wanted to ask something but decided against it. Instead, he swung into the saddle and motioned her forward. She walked beside the horse, every step of hers covering two of his. It should have looked strange, a giantess pacing the plains with a lone cowboy, but out here the land swallowed up questions. By midday they reached a shallow creek. Will dismounted, let his horse drink, and knelt by the water. Tula lingered on the bank, her reflection rippling in the current. She hardly recognized herself, the long black hair uncombed, the shoulders broad as any man's, the height that cast her shadow longer than the cottonwoods nearby. She remembered when she was 12, the year she outgrew her mother, then her father, then every boy in the village. By 16, no man wanted to walk beside her, only stare. By 20, they called her a beast. And by 22, she was sold. Will's voice broke her trance. "What did they call you?" She looked at him sharply. "You mean before they called me meat?" His jaw tightened, but he waited. "Tula," she said at last. "My mother named me after the running water. But it's been a long time since anyone said it without spitting." Will tested the name quietly, like it mattered. "Tula." Then he stood, brushing off his hands. "Well, you're with me now. Ain't nobody spitting on that name again." She studied him, suspicious of the certainty in his tone. Men often said things they couldn't keep. But Will's eyes were steady, and something in her chest ached from hearing her name spoken without malice. They pushed on west, toward the line of hills. The road narrowed, and Will kept his hand near his rifle. Tula's instincts were sharper still. She felt eyes on them long before the sound of hooves reached their ears. From the ridge, for riders appeared, dust rising behind them. Tula tensed. She knew the look of bounty men, the lean, hungry eyes, the easy grip on their guns. One of them called down with a sneer, "That's her, all right, Apache Giantess. Thought you'd fetch her first, cowboy?" Will's horse pawed the ground, sensing his unease. He didn't answer. The leader, a scarred man with a voice like rusted iron, shouted, "Step aside, fella. There's a butcher in Santa Fe who'll pay triple what you gave. Ain't no use standing in the way of silver." Tula's hands curled into fists. Her breath came harsh and fast, not from fear but from rage that rose like wildfire. She'd been hunted enough. She'd been stared at, mocked and dragged. No more. She stepped forward, her towering frame making the bounty men hesitate. "She ain't yours," Will said flatly, his hand still near his rifle. The scarred man laughed. "Ain't yours neither." In the space of a heartbeat, the standoff broke. A gun was drawn, the crack split the air, and Will's horse reared. Tula lunged with speed that defied her size, her hand closing around a man's leg and yanking him clean off his saddle. The rider hit the ground with a thud, breath knocked out of him, before she swung her arm and sent him sprawling into the dust. Will's rifle barked, and another bounty man tumbled from his horse, clutching his shoulder. The two remaining men turned their fire toward Tula, bullets slicing the air. She moved, but one grazed her arm, tearing through flesh. The sting of it only fueled her fury. She seized a fallen branch as thick as her forearm and swung it, smashing it against one rider's horse, sending the beast bolting and its rider crashing. The scarred man cursed, firing again, but Will's second shot took his hat clean off and made him duck low. That moment was all Tula needed. She closed the distance, towering over him, and wrenched the revolver from his hand with brutal force. He looked up at her, sweat streaking through the dust on his face, and for the first time, she saw fear. "You'll tell your kind," she said, her voice trembling with power. "That Tula is not for slaughter." Then she hurled him backward, the revolver clattering to the dirt. The surviving bounty hunters scrambled, dragging their wounded and fleeing in a haze of dust. Silence fell again, broken only by Tallulah's ragged breathing. She stood, blood dripping from her arm, her chest rising and falling like thunderclouds. Will approached slowly, lowering his rifle. "You all right?" She looked at the wound, then at him. "I've carried worse." But the truth lay in her eyes. Pain, not just of flesh, but of a life stolen piece by piece. He saw it, and for the first time he felt the enormity of what it meant to stand beside her. She wasn't just a woman wronged. She was a storm the world had tried to cage. They rode hard into the night, pushing west until the stars lit the sky. Around the fire, Tula sat silent, her arm wrapped in cloth torn from Will's shirt. The crackle of flames painted her face in shifting light, shadows dancing across the sharp planes of her features. Will broke the silence. "You fought like you've been fighting your whole life." Her eyes flicked to him, then to the fire. "Because I have." He waited, giving her space, until her voice came again, low and heavy. "I was a child when they first brought traders to my village. They looked at me like I was already sold. My people grew ashamed of me. Too big for a woman, too strong, too strange. My father said no man would ever want me. When the traders offered coin, he saw his chance. By the time I was 17, I was no longer his daughter. I was theirs, and theirs after that, until I was nothing but a story they laughed about." The fire popped, and the words hung in the smoke between them. Will didn't interrupt. He only listened, and it seemed to disarm her more than any question could. At last, she looked at him. "Why did you buy me?" The directness of it made him pause. He stared into the flames, then spoke quietly. "Because when I saw you up there, I knew I couldn't ride past. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was suicide. But I've watched enough cruelty to know when it's time to put my hand down on the table. That was my time." Her gaze lingered on him, searching for the lie, the selfish reason, the mask. But none came, only a weary honesty. For the first time in years, her chest loosened. Just a little. The night stretched on, stars wheeling above them, and Tula lay down near the fire, her body curling like a fortress around her wounded arm. Sleep didn't come easy, but when it did, it was the first time she dreamt of something other than chains. Will stayed awake longer, staring into the embers, listening to her breathing steady. He knew what lay ahead. The bounty men would talk. Word would spread. More would come, hungrier, better armed, less afraid. But he also knew something else. He wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was bound to her. A choice had been made, and there was no undoing it. The prairie night held them both, two souls scarred in different ways, bound by an act of defiance. And though the world might still call her a giantess meant for slaughter, here, under the stars, she was simply Tula. Under a sky of low-hanging clouds, the land felt heavy with silence. The year was still 1871, and spring winds swept the plains, carrying dust and the scent of smoke from distant camps. Tula sat with her knees drawn to her chest, staring at the fire Caleb had made between them. Its glow painted her face in shades of copper and gold, but her eyes were somewhere far away. She hadn't spoken much since they'd left Amarillo, not after all that had happened. Caleb kept watch across the horizon, his rifle resting against his leg, but his thoughts weren't with the horizon. They were with her. Tallulah's shoulders rose and fell with slow breaths, as though every breath was a battle she was forcing herself to win. She looked stronger than any woman he had ever seen, but right now she seemed fragile, caught in a place between fury and grief. Caleb had learned not to push too hard, but silence itself was a weight neither of them could carry forever. "You're not sleeping," he said finally, his voice steady but quiet. Her head turned slightly, though her gaze remained fixed on the flames. "Sleep brings faces," she murmured. "Faces I can't shut away." Caleb nodded, poking the fire with a stick. "Same for me." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask. But the truth hung between them like smoke, Two people marked by loss, finding themselves in the fragile space of not knowing what came next. Tula shifted then, her eyes finally lifting to meet his. "Why did you pay for me, Caleb?" she asked, her voice low and sharp, as though she'd been waiting for the moment to strike. "Don't say pity. Don't say kindness. Tell me true." The question pierced him. For weeks now, he'd avoided it. He'd told himself the answer didn't matter. But here, in the fire's glow, her demand forced something raw out of him. "Because I couldn't stand it," he admitted, his words slow and deliberate. "The way they looked at you, like you were nothing more than meat. I've seen cattle treated better. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was selfish. But when I saw the knife in that butcher's hand, I knew I'd carry it with me the rest of my days if I let them finish what they started." Tula's brow furrowed, and for a moment, silence hung heavy again. "And what do you carry now?" His jaw tightened. He stared at the fire, then at her, his voice cracking slightly though he forced it firm. "Hope, that's what I carry now. Hope that maybe I wasn't a fool. That maybe you deserved a chance at something more than death in a pen." Her lips trembled, though she bit them to keep steady. The fire crackled, and for a fleeting second, something softened in her eyes. But peace never lasted long in their world. The wind shifted suddenly, bringing with it a sound. Hooves, distant but approaching. Caleb rose to his feet instantly, hand tightening on the rifle. Tula's body went rigid. She rose too, towering, the firelight spilling across her height like the shadow of some spirit. "Riders," Caleb muttered, straining to see beyond the dark. The horizon yielded faint silhouettes moving in formation. Tula's hand clenched at her side. "They come for me," she whispered. Caleb glanced at her sharply. "Or for both of us." He dropped the stick and raised the rifle. "Stay low." But Tula didn't move. She remained standing, her chin lifting with a kind of pride he'd only seen in warriors. The riders drew nearer, torches flickering in their hands. Caleb caught the gleam of rifles strapped across saddles. The men halted just beyond the fire's glow, 6 of them, their horses pawing the dirt. Their leader, a man with a scar slashing across his cheek, leaned forward in his saddle. "Well, I'll be," the man drawled. "The butcher was right. She really is something. Big as the tales say. And you," his eyes flicked to Caleb, "are the fool who thought you could steal her out from under Amarillo's nose." Caleb leveled the rifle at him. "Turn around. Now." The scarred man chuckled. "Or what? You'll shoot us all? Then what, cowboy? You gonna drag her body across the plains yourself?" Tula stepped forward, her voice booming like thunder. "I am not theirs to claim." The horses shied at her voice, some rearing back, but the men steadied them, sneering. "You hear that?" the scarred man jeered. "She thinks she's got a say." The moment snapped. Caleb fired, the crack of the rifle shattering the night. One rider toppled from his saddle. The rest wheeled, guns lifting. The air exploded with gunfire, the fire scattering sparks into the dark. Tula grabbed Caleb's arm, dragging him toward cover as bullets hissed past them. "Run!" Caleb barked, shoving her toward the rocks. But Tula didn't run. Something surged through her, a storm of rage and strength that had been buried too long. She seized a fallen branch thick as a man's arm, swinging it with feral force. When one rider charged close, she struck, and the horse screamed, toppling sideways and crushing its rider beneath. Caleb fired again, taking down another, but there were too many. The scarred man shouted orders, circling, trying to flank them. "Tula!" Caleb shouted, ducking behind the rocks. "We can't hold them." Her chest heaved, her face fierce in the firelight. And then she saw it, the fear in the rider's eyes. For the first time in years, the fear wasn't aimed at her as some freak to be mocked. It was the fear of men who realized the prey they hunted could fight back. She bellowed, voice ringing across the plains. "Come then. Come taste what you call meat." The riders hesitated, but the scarred man snarled, spurring his horse forward. Caleb's rifle cracked again, grazing the man's arm. The others faltered, unwilling to charge into the fury of a woman who looked like she'd risen from legend. At last, the scarred man pulled back, cursing. "This ain't over," he spat, wheeling his horse around. "You can't hide her forever, cowboy. Sooner or later, she'll end up where she belongs." The riders thundered off into the dark, leaving the fire crackling weakly, the smell of blood and gunpowder thick in the air. Caleb lowered the rifle, his breath ragged. He turned to Tula, who stood gripping the shattered branch, her chest heaving. Blood streaked her knuckles, her face shadowed by fury. Slowly, she let the branch drop. The ground trembled under its weight. "They won't stop," she said flatly. "No," Caleb admitted, voice rough. "They won't." She looked at him then, not with gratitude, not with softness, but with the grim understanding of what bound them now. Not chance, not pity, but war. And somewhere in that firelit silence, something unspoken passed between them, that if they were to survive, they would do it together. The flames hissed low, and the wind carried the last echoes of hooves into the night. The desert air was heavy that morning, the kind that clung to the skin and carried every sound farther than it ought to go. Tula woke before dawn, her broad shoulders stiff from a night spent half-dozing against a wagon wheel, her mind restless. The memory of flames, the jeering crowd, the smell of slaughter, still clung to her senses like smoke that refused to clear. She rubbed her wrists where the shackles had bitten weeks before, the scars ridged like ropes. She could not shake the truth. The world had never wanted her alive. The world had made its choice. Yet, sitting across from her, slouched in the dust with his hat pulled low, was a man who had made another choice. Jeremiah Holt looked worn thin, his coat tattered, his boots scuffed from miles walked without care for rest. His revolver sat across his lap, one hand lazily resting on the grip though his eyes were closed. To anyone else he might have looked asleep, but Tula knew better. He was listening, always listening, for danger, for movement, for the men who still hunted her. The silence between them stretched, taut and unspoken. She wanted to thank him, to say something more than the simple words she'd managed when he bought her from the butcher's block. But the words stuck in her throat. She had lived a life of silence, taught by pain that her voice meant little. Even now, every attempt at speaking left her heart thudding hard enough to choke her. Jeremiah opened one eye, the faintest smirk tugging at his weather-beaten face. You stare at a man long enough, he starts to wonder if he's got dust on his chin. She blinked, startled, then looked away, heat rushing to her cheeks. It wasn't embarrassment so much as confusion. She wasn't used to anyone teasing her without cruelty stitched beneath it. "I was thinking," she said, her voice low, cautious. "Why did you do it?" Jeremiah shifted, straightened his hat, and leaned back on his elbows. He studied the pink wash of dawn spreading across the sky before he answered. "Because I was there. Because no one else was willing. Because you ain't cattle, no matter how they tried to sell you." His gaze flicked back to her, steady and unflinching. "You want a better reason than that?" Her lips parted, but nothing came. No one had ever spoken of her like that, not without a sneer or threat hidden behind it. She found herself holding his eyes, searching for some crack, some lie. But there was nothing except truth weathered into his bones. The sound of hooves broke the fragile moment. Both of them rose at once, Tula towering over him, her instincts sharpened from years of suspicion. Jeremiah's hand was already on his revolver, his thumb brushing the hammer back in a smooth, quiet click. Two riders crested the rise, strangers draped in dust and shadow, their faces hidden under wide brims. They slowed when they saw the pair by the wagon, their horses snorting clouds into the cool air. "Morning," one called, his voice rough. "Fine day to be out." Jeremiah didn't lower his gun. "Fine day. What business you got riding this way?" The men exchanged a glance. One spat into the dirt. "Heard tell of an Apache Giantess gone missing from the yards in Tombstone. Rumor says a drifter might have taken her." His eyes slid past Jeremiah, fixing on Tula. Can't say I ever seen a woman that size, but she fits the tale. Tula felt her stomach knot. The men's eyes lingered too long, hungry and cruel, just like the ones in the crowd that day. Jeremiah didn't flinch. Rumors run wild in this land. Best you keep riding before you choke on him. The riders shifted uneasily. Their hands brushed their belts, where iron gleamed. The standoff stretched, brittle and dangerous. Then Jeremiah stepped forward, calm but sharp-edged. I don't repeat myself. Ride. The silence cracked. The men scowled, muttered something under their breath, then tugged their reins and turned back over the ridge. Dust rose behind them, swallowing their shapes into the horizon. Tula exhaled, her body loosening, though the tightness in her chest lingered. Jeremiah holstered his revolver but didn't relax. They'll spread the word, she said quietly. They will, he answered, and more will come. She stared at him, troubled. Why keep me then? You'll be hunted too. They'll call you traitor. They'll kill you for it. Jeremiah met her gaze with a steady, almost defiant calm. Let 'em try. The words hung heavy. For a moment, she saw something in him she couldn't quite name. Not pity, not obligation, something fiercer. Days turned into a blur of miles. They traveled through gullies, across dry creek beds, and along ridges that overlooked endless seas of rock and sand. At night, Tula lay awake, listening to coyotes howl, her mind gnawed by doubt. Every kindness Jeremiah showed, splitting rations, offering his coat against the chill, watching over her while she slept, cut deep into her scars. She wanted to believe it. She wanted to trust, but trust had cost her too much in life. One night, as the fire dwindled to embers, Jeremiah began to speak, his voice low. My wife, he said. Her name was Mary. We had a boy, Samuel. He was 8. His hand rested on his knee, fingers curling. Raiders came while I was gone. Apache, they said. I came home to ashes. Tula froze, her chest tightening. She could feel his pain in the way his jaw clenched, the way his voice went raw. You think I don't know what it means, standing beside you? Folks'll say I betrayed my own blood. Maybe I did. Maybe I don't give a damn anymore. His eyes lifted, burning into hers. But I looked at you that day, and I saw more than what they called you. I saw what they meant to do, and I couldn't stand by. Not again. Her throat worked, but words refused to come. She had expected hatred when he spoke of raiders. Instead, she saw a man split by loss, choosing not vengeance but defiance. She reached out, hesitated, then set her hand, massive, scarred, over his. For the first time, she didn't feel the weight of her size. He didn't flinch. He simply held still, letting the silence between them carry the truth neither could voice. But peace was never meant to last. By the following week, their trail had grown perilous. Jeremiah spotted fresh prints in the sand, horsemen circling like wolves. At dawn, the ambush came. Gunfire cracked from the ridgeline, bullets kicking dust around them. Jeremiah shoved Tula down behind a boulder, drawing and firing with practiced precision. She covered her head, the sound ringing like thunder in her skull. Stay low, he barked, though his voice was tight with strain. Tula peeked over the stone. Half a dozen men closed in, rifles flashing. She saw Jeremiah duck, roll, return fire, his movements sharp, deadly. 2 men fell, but more kept coming, and something inside her broke. She couldn't hide while he bled for her. She couldn't crouch like prey while he fought against the pack. A roar built in her chest, tearing loose from her throat before she knew it. Tula surged from cover, her towering frame rising like a storm. Rocks scattered under her boots as she charged. The men froze at the sight of her, eyes wide, guns wavering. She ripped a rifle from one man's hands and snapped it like kindling, hurling the pieces aside. Another swung his pistol. She caught his wrist and flung him across the ground as if he were no heavier than a child. Jeremiah cursed, half in awe, half in panic. Tula! But it was too late. She was a force unleashed. Every ounce of pain, shame, and fury turned into strength. Men scrambled, shouting, firing wildly. Bullets grazed her arms, tearing flesh, but she barely flinched. Her roar drowned out the gunfire. Her fists sent men sprawling. By the time the dust settled, the survivors fled in terror, leaving their dead behind. Tula stood panting, blood streaking her skin, her chest heaving. Jeremiah approached slowly, revolver lowered, eyes wide. "You?" His voice faltered, then steadied. "You saved my life." She turned to him, trembling. For the first time in years, she didn't feel cursed. She didn't feel hunted. She felt alive. And in his gaze she saw no fear, only respect. The night that followed was quiet, almost reverent. Jeremiah cleaned her wounds with careful hands, his touch steady despite the tremor beneath it. She watched him in silence, her heart unmoored, uncertain. "You're not what they said," he whispered finally. "You never were." And though she couldn't speak, tears burned her eyes, hot and heavy, as if the desert itself had cracked open to release them. For once, the world hadn't taken, it had given, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. And so, the giantess who was once marked for slaughter found a place where her name would no longer be whispered with fear, but spoken with pride. Tula's story is not just about survival, it's about defiance, about love, about choosing to stand when the world would rather see you crawl. But tell me, if you were alive back then, standing in that dusty street, would you have turned away like the crowd, or stood beside her like the cowboy did? Think on that. And if this story gripped you, share it, leave your thoughts below, and don't forget to follow for the next tale from the wild frontier, where legends are born and hearts are tested.